Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. My name is Ariana Orn, a member of the Special Competitive Studies Project. I am honored to introduce our next distinguished group of speakers. Please join me in welcoming Ann Neuberger, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech, the Honorable Jen Easterly, Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Ambassador Nathaniel Fick, Ambassador at Large for Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the U.S. State Department. And we are thrilled to be joined by Eric Rosenbach of Harvard University, one of our nation's foremost experts on cyber, as a moderator for this panel. Over to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you. So coming right after lunch is always an interesting spot. And I wanted to start, since this is the Ash Carter Exchange on Innovation and National Security, by just giving a very quick personal remembrance of Ash. I worked with him almost every day for about 13 years, both at the Kennedy School, where in the beginning his office was right across the hall from mine, then in the Pentagon, including when I was his chief of staff, and then back at Harvard. And I still miss him a lot, but know that seeing something like this would make him really happy, in particular to see a lot of the things that he worked on and he had the ideas about creating, taking seed and taking root and kind of growing. Also, I worked really closely with Ash on cyber issues, in particular when he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Huge thrill for me then, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, so that's pretty far down the food chain compared to the Deputy. And you know what Ash would do? He would call me at least 3 times a week, skipping everyone in the chain of command, and he would say, "Hey brother, let's do something today. Bring me a memo, I'll knock down all the bureaucrats, and we're gonna make something happen." And it was that ethos of getting things done on things that mattered, in particular cyber at the time, it was really motivating to me to see that there was someone who was like that, and then someone who would follow up relentlessly to make sure that you had done everything in his little black book with the 10 empty boxes beside it too. So miss him. And what is also interesting is back during that time, this cast of characters were in different places doing different things on cyber. It was not infrequent that Ann would call me from the NSA. Jen was working on building Cyber Command. Nate, I think, actually was still at the Kennedy School for at least part of that time. And it's really, I think, also inspiring to see now this team helping the United States stay safe, defend itself, and defend our allies and partners against cyber threats. So we're really lucky to have them doing what they do. Thank you all so much for what it is you do. It's like all-star cyber lineup. But I'd also like to say, now I'm at Harvard, and I have the, I would say, flexibility to not be on talking points and try to think of really hard questions that I can ask this distinguished panel of leaders. And the place I'd like to start is, of course, I think on probably the most important thing today from my perspective, which is on Ukraine. And I am going to start with Ann, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. This is a very hard job, you all. Being a Deputy National Security Advisor in such a tough space, and I'm sure is working 20 hours a day. So thank you for what you're doing. And going into the Ukraine conflict, a lot of cyber experts expected that there would be a massive Russian cyber attack against Ukraine, just like there had been in years before against the electric power infrastructure. You remember NotPetya, which caused a cyber contagion around the world. But it didn't really happen. Why? Is it because cyber doesn't actually work as a weapon? Is it that you were authorizing offensive cyber operations preemptively to take out the Russian cyber attacks? How would you explain it, Ann? Ann loves to talk about offensive cyber attacks.
It's so nice to be spending time with you again, Eric. First, it is terrific to be here. And like you, I wanted to give just a moment of tribute to Ash Carter and the role he played. So the moment, I think, to your point, sharing an anecdote that comes to mind, was during the period of our counter-ISIS fight, when Secretary Carter was really working to bring to bear the power of offensive cyber, disrupting communications, disrupting ISIS's ability to share their recipes for weapons. And at the time, I was working as the civilian deputy of NSA's intelligence operations. And that was at the crux of the question of how an intelligence agency and cyber command work together, how you operationalize those equity concerns, how you take the traditional intelligence community's long-term goal for persistent intelligence collection and use it in effects. And I recall Secretary Carter's just push for outcomes, for progress, really drove that partnership and drove people working together, drove thinking on how you use offensive cyber in the context of a conflict, and just that mission piece. And to your point, it was the constant press of keeping him satisfied, trying to deliver on that vision that we felt. You talk about feeling it at a DASD level, talk about feeling it all the way over in one of the intelligence agencies at an operational level, all the way through. His energy and his vision came through. So he's very much missed. And I think he would be very happy to see everyone here, this community, talking about how to make innovation work for our military today. So with regard to your question, I think one doesn't know, but it could be a combination of three things. Option one of that combination is defense. Ukraine learned the lesson of the 2014-15 conflict when Russia invaded and targeted Ukraine's energy grid. And Ukraine really doubled down. The Department of Energy helped, our colleagues in Europe helped, and worked to disconnect from the Soviet grid. In fact, just in the few weeks before, they came into us with a request for support to accelerate their cutting off the traditional Soviet-era connection to the Russian grid and connecting to the European Union grid. And with credit to the Europeans who enabled that connection. So first, fundamentally, the work on defense that the Ukrainians did made them a much harder target. And I think that's a shot in the arm for folks who work defense, who, as Jen knows well, feel they come in every day and it's a hard task. It's a task that feels like pushing rocks uphill. I think the second piece of it certainly is that we expected, looking at the intelligence, that the Russians expected it to be a very quick conflict. And as such, they wanted the infrastructure in the country to be preserved. So putting a focus on disrupting power, disrupting telecom was less of a focus because they wanted that there and then needed it later from an intelligence collection perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think the final point we would say from a larger perspective is President Biden did communicate. This was more in the context of cyber attacks against the US or our allies and partners, that any disruptive attack would be met with a strong response. Mm-hmm. So in the context of the second question I expected you to ask, which is, why didn't we see cyber attacks against the homeland? Certainly the tremendous hard work across the intelligence community, Jen's team to push out intelligence, but also I think the way the president communicated that deterrence message, both at his summit with President Putin the summer before and in the run-up to the conflict where that was said repeatedly as well.
Okay. One follow-up question. I always teach my students, ask the hard follow-up question, deflator questions. But it's not because the Russians are bad at cyber. Are they overhyped? Do they actually not have much of an offensive cyber game when it matters, the Russians?
I think we really do believe the Russians have an effective offensive cyber program. It's fundamentally more challenging to execute persistent long-term operations. We've seen them continuously, and you've seen products from Microsoft and Google describing the scale, the number of offensive cyber operations that the Russians have done continuously, actually achieving long-term impact, disconnecting a system, disabling its safety components, maintaining that for a long time when you have committed defenders working to recover is, I think, harder than we thought. I think we all have this kind of, thinking of, well, there's a magic cyber button and press it. And I think both from the perspective of having worked defensive cyber operation and congratulating on all the progress defensive teams have made, we've learned it's pretty hard to have the targeted intelligence, to have the understanding of safety backup systems, to execute a long-term operation like the one you have in mind, disabling energy systems for a period of time.
Okay, great. and fair to say the Ukrainians are very good at defense, having gotten a lot of exercise in the years prior to that. So now, Nate, I'd like to go to you. Nate, as you all know, is the ambassador for cyber and emerging technologies at the State Department. A new job. He's the first person in the job. Perfect background for this, from my perspective. Not only a former military officer, but also former CEO of a cybersecurity software firm. So has experience in the private sector. And Nate, my question is this: in the years immediately after the Russians conducted these big cyber attacks against Ukraine in 2014, 2015, 2016, there was a lot of hesitance to provide them with support. At the time, we put in for an assistance package, and what came back is you can send them encrypted radios. So you know what? That doesn't actually have anything to do with cyber and didn't help the Ukrainians. But I read that in your role now, you actually have a little bit of money and are trying to build partnerships and maybe new types of cyber alliances. Talk to us a little bit about what you at the State Department are doing now to help Ukraine, in this conflict.
Thanks, Eric. And it's great to be here with all of you and with Ann and Jen. And I am also a student of Dr. Carter's, and so it's especially meaningful to be part of a tribute to him, and he had a great influence on me. As a newly separated Marine combat veteran, finding my way in graduate school, feeling like I didn't fit in and I maybe shouldn't be there. And he definitely, like he did for many of us, helped us find our path. So I'm eternally grateful to him. You go back to 2014, Eric, and I think your qualifier was a little bit of money. And since 2014, our cyber assistance to Ukraine has been, in round numbers, about $85 million, which does remind me of the old joke of throwing nickels around like they're manhole covers. If we think that this really matters, and we're going through a phase shift here where everything is connected. We're connecting 1 billion things every quarter globally. This is the hybrid war of the future, perhaps, the integration of World War I style tactics and World War II and a hypothetical, or maybe World War III, all side by side. And so providing this kind of assistance is, in my view, critical across at least 3 dimensions. There's the preventive piece. That's the holy grail, right? Let's provide the kind of capability and people, process, and technology to prevent the bad thing from happening. And I think Ann spoke about the value of good defense, and it's absolutely true. Second is incident response. When the bad thing happens, we have to get there with partners and allies quickly and effectively. And we need to make sure we have the mechanisms in place and the authorities in order to do that. And then third, long term, is capacity building and support in order to build capable partners and allies for the long term in the digital world, just as we've been focused for 70 years or more in the kinetic world all around us. And Ukraine's a terrific example of all of this. And look, my point of view, I'm generally an optimist in life. I think the Ukraine war overall is a very dark cloud. And if there's a silver lining, I do think one of those silver linings is the degree to which it's really accelerated how we think about public-private coordination and partnership. And it has been phenomenally effective in a bunch of areas in ways that I think we all hope can be, we can learn the lessons, internalize them, and replicate them.
Great, thank you. Jen is the director of CISA, which is the agency in the Department of Homeland Security responsible for cybersecurity and infrastructure security. So this is a big job, you all. For those of you who are not cyber dorks like I am, you may not realize how big a job this is. Essentially responsible for protecting the homeland against cyber attack. And Jen, also a very interesting background, career Army officer in the Intelligence Corps, built Cyber Command when she was there, then worked in the White House on counterterrorism programs as director, senior director. Jen is probably expecting that I'll follow the Ukraine trend and ask about that. But I'd actually prefer to ask you about something I just read recently that you hinted at. So I'm reading between the lines, which is traditionally when we think about the cyber threat from China and the United States, it's about the theft of intellectual property. But there's a rumor and maybe reading into what you said, that the Chinese may be doing more offensive preparatory action against critical infrastructure in the United States. Can you just confirm that for everyone here today?
Your new Delta Tau Chi name is now Cyberdork. First of all, it's so wonderful to be here. Such a great event to honor Ash's legacy. And, as the rest of the team said, he was a wonderful mentor to me. So thanks for including me and to be with great teammates. So to pivot a little bit off Ukraine, many lessons learned, agree absolutely on the power of defense, agree on the power of public-private partnerships. I think the Ukraine war will look back and be a high watermark for persistent operational collaboration. But the other big lesson that we are learning, and we work with the Ukrainian cyber defense team many times a week, sometimes every day, is the power of resilience. When you think about cyber resilience to thwart cyber attacks, and yes, there actually has been a lot of cyber directed at Ukraine. It's just been overshadowed by the barbarism of the kinetic attacks, frankly. But they've been able, given all of their training and all of the improvements that they've done to thwart cyber attacks. Look at some of the innovation with moving their data to the cloud before the invasion, being able to almost seamlessly move from Viasat, which was taken out by the Russians, over to Starlink, but also functional resilience, the ability to recover from the whole variety of attacks, both cyber and kinetic. But I think most importantly, and this is really the China piece, given the threats, really the preeminent threats that we face from China and the ongoing threats that we face from Russia, the power of societal resilience, the ability of the Ukrainian people to continue to fight, to continue to resist, to achieve victory, I think is an important lesson for all of us, because as we're talking about our lessons learned, I think we need to think about the lessons that the Chinese are learning. And I think in particular, if there is a conflict in the Straits, they are going to learn from the Russians the fact that deterrence, as Anne was saying, deterrence works, both deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. And I think they are not going to make the same mistakes as the Russians have, and they're not going to be deterred in the same way. And if you just look at the IC assessment that was published earlier this year that talks very explicitly about the fact that in the event of a conflict with the US, we will almost certainly see China use aggressive cyber operations against our critical infrastructure and almost certainly be able to disrupt critical infrastructure to include rail, to include oil and natural gas pipelines, essentially to deter military deployments and to induce societal panic. And so, every day as the cyber defenders, we are motivated by this urgency to work with our private sector colleagues, our critical infrastructure owners and operators, to ensure that we are prepared to be able to withstand, to respond, to recover, and to remain resilient in our nation to any sort of offensive moves that we might see from China.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jen. Jen also has mastered the art of answering the question she wants to, rather than the one that's asked. We would try to pin her down if this were less than a friendly environment. And next to you, I'm in the luxurious position now of being able to actually study and think about cyber, as opposed to y'all who are just grinding away all the time.
We're not thinking.
And that was a good one. There's some recent research that suggests ransomware attacks in the United States last year were down more than 40%. The amount of ransom paid per attack was down almost 50%. So that leads to the question of why? Is it because the White House is really kicking tail with a new strategy? We got a dream team up here and it's making a difference? Is it that we've cracked attribution on the blockchain? Is it that the price of Bitcoin is down and it just doesn't pay?
So Eric's innovating on asking a question and answering it at the same time. It's an interesting combination of all of the above plus. So Colonial Pipeline in some ways was a gift. because folks had talked about what cyber attacks could do to critical infrastructure, but that was visible, that was there. The lines at gas stations, the work with the company, and seeing, frankly, the low level of cybersecurity resilience at a major critical infrastructure entity. And that drove a focus on both sides, both a focus to say we've got to tackle this ransomware threat. It's disrupting critical services in this country, from pipelines in that example to, frankly, hospitals and schools, all the way through to we have to think differently and how we address the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. But I'll focus on the ransomware piece. So first, at the White House level, we recognize that it took a whole of country effort and, frankly, a global effort, because ransomware has infrastructure in one set of countries, people in another set of countries, largely, it used to be Russia, Ukraine, now largely Russia, targeting infrastructure around the world. So to address it really takes that transnational global partnership. So from a White House perspective, kind of bringing together, as you said, the dream team in 4 pillars, and driving that work both across the US and then building the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, which has now grown to 40 countries, coordinating that same work around the world. And those 4 pillars are, first, as you noted, ransomware is a money-driven problem. So tackling illicit use of crypto, tackling the elements of crypto infrastructure that are part of the enabling of laundering of money. So for example, you've seen the Treasury Department designate Tornado.cash, a core mixer, and the roles mixer plays are, like I said, mixing a bunch of licit transactions with illicit transactions, so it's harder to follow the chain, as you noted, on a very public blockchain. And Treasury has now taken that work, know your customer, blockchain analysis, capacity building, to our international counter-ransomware initiative. So that's one big piece of it. A second big piece of it is disruption. Fundamentally, the work the Department of Justice has done, you've seen the takedown of Hive and related takedowns that have occurred to target the broader ransomware ecosystem. So kind of moving to that disruption strategy from a traditional law enforcement strategy because of the fact that we don't have a law enforcement channel anymore with some of the key countries, namely Russia, where these individuals live. Third is, of course, resilience efforts, focusing on working to improve resilience. And I think CISA-StopRansomware.gov effort, really important effort to point to there. And then finally, diplomacy. So at State, Nate has a team who helps coordinate around the world our diplomatic initiatives on this, whether it is working together to have countries call out in specific forums, Russia for harboring ransomware actors. So those 4 lines of effort, and I would note the disruption shift and the illicit crypto is really key, kind of getting more aggressive as counter to that strategy. And then, as I said, taking it internationally. We're having the 3rd International Ransomware Summit we'll host here in DC in October. And the range of countries involved has really we want to make it riskier, costlier, and harder, but never rest on our laurels because ransomware remains a problem.
Okay, that's good, thank you. Jenna is going to go to you next, shifting over to AI. Last week you said, and don't quote me here, this is rough translation, something along the lines of AI is one of the most serious weapons the world has known. You can correct my quote, that's my memory of it, I didn't write it down. Earlier today, we've had lots of people talking about how great AI is and how AI is empowering and all the neat things about it. You seem to have a different perspective. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, I can. As you alluded to earlier, I spent the majority of my career, 33 years, some in uniform, intelligence, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity. And while I consider myself an optimist, we also always need to be in the position where we're thinking about the most probable course of action and the most dangerous course of action in the worst case scenario. And so AI, I think, will be the most powerful capability of our time. That's what I said. And I also worry that it will be the most powerful weapon of this century. Now, the most powerful weapon of the last century were nuclear weapons that were built and protected by governments that were disincentivized to use them, as opposed to AI, which is largely being researched and built in the private sector and driven by competition between corporations who at the end of the day are fiduciarily responsible for profit maximization, not security. And this is really just a continuation of what we've seen from the internet and software and social media, which is about speed to market and features as opposed to safety and security, which I think is, foundational, and the shifting of burdens is a key piece of the national cyber strategy. So we can stipulate that AI will do incredible things. Eric mentioned some of them earlier. It will make our lives easier. It will make our lives better, but it will also make lives easier and better for our adversaries and our enemies, large and small, who will use these capabilities to do significant harms. So for some of you who saw the TED Talk from Greg Brockman, who's the co-founder of OpenAI, who used it to create an extravagant meal, one person will use it to create a dinner party. Another will use it to create cyber weapons or bioweapons or chemical weapons, or to deploy shockingly realistic deep fakes. I think it's of note that Jeff Hinton left Google so he could talk about AI risk, and he gave an interview to the New York Times where he specifically talked about it's hard to prevent, it's hard to see how we can prevent bad people from using it for bad things, and he specifically talked about misinformation. Now, from what we understand, GPT-5 may come out in September of 2025 or 2024, just before the elections, and I think that is a significant concern. I think the good news is that we have people like Dr. Hinton and others who are raising the alarms. We have the administration leaning forward with the AI Bill of Rights, with the AI Risk Management Framework, with the meeting last week with the vice president and senior industry leaders to figure out what are the guardrails that we can put in place, what are the policies, and what's the regulatory framework so that we can ensure that these capabilities are developed with democratic principles as opposed to what the Chinese are doing, heavily focused on regulation, saying content must align with socialist core principles. I think the bad news is, and Eric alluded to this is moving incredibly fast. The explosion of large language models is progressing 3 times the speed of Moore's law, meaning doubling every 6 months, twice every 18 months, what we see with semiconductor size and speed. So we don't have a lot of time to be able to put these frameworks in place to ensure that the capabilities can be used in a way that Americans can benefit from the advances, but also be protected from the harms. And so I have a lot of concerns about that.
Super interesting, Jen. Quick follow-up. Do you think AI should be regulated by the Hill? You talked about a regulatory framework, so I'm not going to nail you down on that, but if there are these potential harms, isn't that the space when you study public policy for a regulatory intervention?
Yeah, so I'm not a regulator, but what I will say is I think people will say regulation will crush technological innovation. I actually think you can have both. I do not think it's a trade-off. I think there's some places where innovation is actually spurred by regulation. Think of emission standards in electric cars. The short history of the internet, if you go back to 1983 when the TCP/IP protocol was implemented to allow computers to talk to each other, security was never a thought, right? Dan Kaminsky, the famous security research pioneer, he said the internet was never designed to be secure. It was designed to move pictures of cats. It's very good at moving pictures of cats. No security. Software was not built for security. Social media was all about moving fast and breaking things, and we have disinformation and a lot of mental health challenges with our children. So I think AI is much more powerful than those technologies, and frankly, we need to look at a framework that enables us to protect it, but still take advantage of the amazing innovation. Now, that's a magical thinking, some would say, but these are the really hard things that we have to do, because if we allow these technologies to fall into the hands of our adversaries, they will use them to do unimaginably bad things. And the history of security is both the power of imagination and the failure of imagination. And as leaders, we need to understand how to leverage the first and how to prevent the latter.
Okay, great. Nate, you're now out all around the world talking about emerging technologies, and I assume AI with a lot of different countries too. What have you seen internationally that we here in the US can learn from, say, the European Union or others who are thinking about addressing this in Asia, Southeast Asia?
I am learning firsthand a lesson that I first learned, I guess, as a father, which is pounding the table and saying it's my way or the highway is not generally an effective strategy. And so it's actually incumbent upon us, in my view. When I say us, I mean the United States and our most like-minded partners, who together have the bulk of the innovative ecosystem in these emerging technology areas, including AI. The companies, the technical talent, the foundational research, the great universities, it's incumbent upon us to articulate the positive, attractive, compelling vision for what the AI-enabled, empowered future can look like and attract others to it. So I think we should try as hard as we can not to cast everything in purely competitive terms. It's easy to go there in every conversational dynamic. There's an intrinsically competitive nature of this, of course, but we try to anchor it all in that attractive, compelling vision so that others can sign up to it and join us and bring with them their populations, their GDP, their innovative companies, their great universities, their foundational R&D dollars. So I start from that position, Eric. And then I do believe, and I'll test an academic idea here for public peer review, which is always risky, but I think that tech innovation as a source of national and coalition power sits more on the level of geography or demography than it does GDP or military capacity. These traditional measures like GDP and like military capacity are increasingly downstream of technology innovation. So we do have to get this right. We have to make sure that the power of these technologies is harnessed in accordance with our values and that they're fundamentally rights respecting. I have a great colleague who reminded me this week that it was 12 years from Hiroshima to the IAEA. We don't have 12 years. To Jen's point, this is moving so quickly. So there's an element of getting our domestic house in order with our closest like-minded allies and partners where the bulk of this innovative power sits. And then I think we need to multilateralize it and attract people to the cause for legitimacy and staying power.
Okay, great. For the last round of questions, I think last, I have some up my sleeve if not. I wanted to ask a little bit more about team building and leadership because all three of you are also in very interesting leadership positions. And Jen, I was going to start with you. CISA, I will say with fondness but candor, was not always viewed as the premier place to work if you were in the cyber field. And that is totally different now, you all. I think in almost large part, not only large part, completely because of Jenny, certainly in what she's doing. She personally writes emails to students of mine she's recruiting to come to CISA. She's got some really amazing talent coming in. And CISA now is just a cool place to work where you have impact and a lot of people want to go. So the question is this, Jen, how'd you do that?
Well, I'm not going to take all credit on this. We are the newest agency in the federal government. We're established in 2018. My great friend and predecessor, Chris Krebs, stood us up. What we're trying to do is create something that is different. Not a lumbering bureaucracy, but something that is much more like a public-private collaborative. And so 27 years in the government, the most important job for director of CISA was my 4.5 years at Morgan Stanley, because you got a chance to see how the private sector recruits and retains talent, how the private sector defends itself in cyber, how to talk to CEOs and boards about the priority of corporate cyber responsibility, and how to build an amazing team that knows how to collaborate and innovate. And so a lot of that I brought to CISA with me. And I'd heard the same thing. I'd never been in DHS before. And frankly, when we were at NSA, we were making the argument that, oh, those DHS guys don't know what they're doing. Let us do it. And part of that was kind of a motivator at the end of the day. And so I came in the summer of 2021, and the first thing I focused on was how do you co-create a culture of innovation and collaboration and inclusion and innovation and ownership and empowerment, the things that we recognize from the military, right? At the end of the day is servant leadership, and how do you create that magic that brings on the best talent? And so we've been working really, really hard to do cool and different things to be able to attract that great talent and come up with new ways. We just announced yesterday a cyber innovation fellowship where we're able to bring in people from the private sector to work at CISA for 2 days a week. They stay on our systems, they help us with hard problems, but they're still a member of their company. And it creates that opportunity to bring lessons from the private sector to create that connective tissue that we need with the private sector, because at the end of the day, our mission is to reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And we don't own the vast majority of it. So there's nothing more important than creating trust with our partners. And in a world where you're dealing with terrible things and the possibility of powerful weapons that we can't control, at the end of the day, we're all leaders. And, Napoleon said leaders are dealers in hope. And so it's coming in every day with relentless positivity. And, I touch my Ted Lasso sign at my door that's sitting over my door with believe every day, and believing in the power of every single person who comes to CISA. I want them to wake up in the morning and be excited about what they do, feel respected by their teammates, feel valued and empowered by their leaders, and feel like they're making an impact every single day for the nation. It doesn't matter what you get paid. People come here as a calling because they get to solve the toughest problems with the best teammates and feel like they're making a real difference.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Nate, you're the leader of an organization that has never existed before. It's at the State Department, which we all admire and love, but is not always known for being super dynamic as a bureaucracy. And I read recently that you have the goal of placing a cyber diplomat in each embassy around the world sometime within the next year, too. Tell us, how's it going there at State in terms of building this new cyber team?
Eric is just lobbing hand grenades across the stage.
These are softballs. These are softballs. They look like a hand grenade softball.
So, look, the State Department, like any organization I've ever been a part of, the Marine Corps, a tech startup, a big global technology company, is fundamentally an elevator assets organization. At the end of the day, we have some old computers and some crappy chairs. Everything we have that's valuable goes down the elevators at night and goes home. That's it. It really is just about empowering people, recruiting the best people we can, retaining them and empowering them. And that's fundamentally what this initiative to put basically trained cyber and digital officers in every embassy is about. Jen, you alluded to some lessons we learned in our 20s in the military. A lesson I learned is pushing power and autonomy down and out in an organization. If we centralize every decision, if we build layers of efficiency, we're going to be slower than the tech and we're going to be slower than our adversaries. And so our goal is to have it basically trained, that is trained at the Foreign Service Institute, our in-house training academy, a basically trained cyber and digital officer in every embassy around the world by the end of next year. We're about at an eighth of the way through the time, and we're a little bit more than an eighth of the way through the staffing, so we're on track. The next class was oversubscribed. The one after that is filling fast, so we're going to get there.
That's amazing.
And there is broad-based recognition that we have to institutionalize in this large government organization, taking a different approach to technology diplomacy, because everything depends on it.
Great. Okay. And you have, honestly, an even more difficult challenge because you don't have a big organization. You're trying to run the interagency. That's a hard team to run, that's for sure. What have you learned from doing that? And how has it gone? Give us some advice about how you run the interagency team when you're trying to tackle some of the wickedest problems when it comes to cyber.
You know, it's such an interesting question. The like you say, in each of the wickedest problems, we see that they require a combination of our capabilities as government. Because if they weren't so wicked, one of the terrific agencies would have solved it, right? So I look at a problem set that we're putting a lot of time and thought into, which is the fact that the North Koreans fundamentally are funding, we estimate, half of their missile program via crypto heists and cyber efforts, right? And to that point, that takes a combination of our Treasury Department really financing, really understanding how money moves, working with the crypto ecosystem. It takes our State Department and our Department of Defense to understand who are these individuals? How could it be that a country like the DPRK is so darn creative in this space? Is there a link between the fact that they have tech workers building some of the software around the world and perhaps the success of their offensive cyber teams in magically finding and exploiting vulnerabilities and gleaning hundreds of $millions a case? How do we bring together the traditional non-proliferation teams who think of traditional forms of weapons funding and have them recognize that it might just be a crypto ecosystem, a tech ecosystem in that way? And then certainly, how do we improve the cybersecurity of banks and crypto infrastructure around the world and understand from our traditional way how we trace money laundering, traditional fiat, all the way through to Hawala networks in the counterterrorism world you all worked in, to now this new form of funds. Because chances are, if we don't have the visibility of those funds, there's many other funding of illicit or malicious activity we're not seeing. And I think fundamentally, it comes to first creating urgency on a problem set, right? Creating visibility on the problem set. So it's sometimes super helpful, to put a call into the intelligence community and say, we have a question. The answer is a product that runs in books all across the national security community. And that's a way to level set knowledge, to say, are you aware that massive elements, we see the DPRK launching 60 to 70 missiles last year, more already this year than in many prior years. How do we raise awareness to say the funding for that is coming from this source, problem set A. B, then ask the question, why do we keep learning about hacks gaining $300-400 million in the news? Where's our gaps of insight? How do we solve that? How do we tap into knowledge in the private sector regarding how one learns about the techniques that are being used here? And then pulling that all the way through and building non-traditional teams. And fundamentally, I find the cool part is in any meeting when you gather agencies together, when it's a listening culture, folks are eager to hear both who has an idea and what's their role in it. And then linking that together and fundamentally ensuring that we will have folks' backs. Because I think listening to our prior conversation, and really all of the folks in this room who have led innovative efforts, particularly when you're earlier in your career, we all know that the Ash Carters of the world made a difference, both in inspiring and in having your back if there were just in hierarchical structures, which parts of government are, or in traditional ways to approach problem sets. If you face resistance, sometimes having somebody reinforcing those efforts and saying, that's a cool idea, or asking a question so that there's the opportunity to hear the answer, makes a big difference. So I think I've been tremendously grateful, and I think that having come from an agency, one tries to always be humble about who's really doing the work as well.
Thank you, Dan. We've just a little bit of time left, so I was going to ask each of you in 20 seconds or left to give advice to all the young people who are out here who see the three of you and think, I want to be that person. I want to do that. Okay? 20 seconds. Jen, what's your one piece of advice to all the young people out here who want to be Jen Easterly?
Do not be afraid of failing.
Okay.
Embrace failure and a growth mindset, and knowing that if you are doing the right thing and treating people well and treating life as a contact sport, because it's all about people, you will be successful. So stay relentlessly positive, work through failure, and always focus on being kind to people.
All right. It's very Ted Lasso. Good job, Jen.
Thank you.
Okay, Ambassador Fick.
Treat every job interview as a two-way street. You're being interviewed, but you're also interviewing your boss. I've had the good fortune to have wonderful bosses.
Okay, good advice. Anne?
I love all of these. I would say the final one is be grateful. I'm a child of refugees, and my father's expression was always, life is okay. We have food for the Sabbath this weekend. And I think sometimes when one takes on hard tasks, and building on the advice you heard, it can get very caught up in the challenges, and recognizing how fortunate we are to live in this country, to have the opportunity to work in this space, to try to make a difference, I think just brings you back to try again every single day.
Great, thank you. You three, thank you so much for what you're doing for America. Thank you for everything you have done. Thanks for making time today. And with that, if you all could join me in